To Robert Cecil, the Right Honourable Lord High Treasurer of England, as concerning the debt of £8 for subsidy demanded of the said Countess of Oxford, she is willing to pay the same as your lordship shall appoint. Only she desireth that she may be discharged, because her name is mistaken as Anne for Elizabeth. Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, married two very different women, although both were born commoners and died countesses. This lecture continues the exploration of Oxford's life, character, and works through the women closest to him, begun with The Roar of the Mouse and Cecil de Vere and what she tells us about Shakespeare, now available on YouTube and through the link on my website. Elizabeth Trentham's response to Robert Cecil's tax levy reveals that Oxford's second wife possessed shrewd business sense and witty self-assurance. Lord High Treasurer, Secretary of State, and Lord Privy Seal, Cecil had proven ruthless in condemning to death those who opposed him. He was Oxford's brother-in-law, and he hated Oxford. Elizabeth's saucy reply takes aim legally and personally, highlighting the absurdity of his dispositive legal flaw. He named the wrong party, his own sister, dead 20 years. Elizabeth mischievously undermines Cecil's ego. She will pay if he will embarrass himself by admitting his error and grovel for such a meager amount. Portia, disguised as the law clerk Balthazar in The Merchant of Venice, could not have better disarmed the Shylock from taking his 8 pounds of flesh. Yet Elizabeth, like all Elizabethan women, lived with many fewer rights than men. As we examine her roles in Oxford's life and after his death, please recall that women were, by law, their fathers, brothers, or husbands' property until death or widowhood. Daughters with brothers could expect little inheritance except a dowry. Women couldn't be executors of wills, not even their husbands. Single and married women could not own or manage real property, contract or sue without a male relative's consent. Married women's lands became their husbands'. Only to widows did the law give some rights. Upon a noble husband's death, minor children became the crown's wards, living with and obeying whatever guardian bought the right from the court of wards to arrange their marriages. Elizabeth maneuvered around these legal obstacles, thanks to her very particular set of skills and two remarkable men, her father and her husband. Instead of a pious mouse, obedient to all early modern standards of womanhood like Anne, Elizabeth was a griffin, with the alert head of an eagle atop the body of a lioness. 3 griffins adorn her heraldic lozenge, their heads black, their beaks red. With her extant letters, beautifully written in almost modern English, legal documents, her contemporaries' observations about her, and historical and literary content, I hope to better acquaint you with both Elizabeth and Oxford, convince you to dismiss some myths about them, and leave you understanding why, without Elizabeth Trentham, there would be no Shakespeare. As always, I am indebted to Nina Green's primary source collection. Elizabeth was born in Rochester, Staffordshire, to a family of landed gentry in late 1561 or early 1562, making her at least a decade younger than Oxford, an age gap which pleased Duke Orsino quite well in Twelfth Night. Eardswick's View of Staffordshire described 1593 Rochester in England's West Midlands as both pleasant and very profitable. The Trentham properties ran sheep and corn mills. Elizabeth's paternal grandfather, Richard, formerly a member of Parliament, converted an Augustinian abbey near a Roman fort into a manor house in which his heir, Thomas, raised his family. Her maternal grandfather, William Sneed, was a Staffordshire knight, High Sheriff, and Justice of the Peace. Her father, Thomas, was related through the female line to the Devereaux and Earls of Essex. In 1571, he became a Knight of the Shire and attended his first Parliament in the House of Commons, coinciding with his future son-in-laws in the House of Lords, although Thomas died before Elizabeth married Oxford. As Staffordshire's High Sheriff, Thomas worked directly with William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, and Sir Francis Walsingham. Following the sudden death of his kinsman, Walter Devereux, 1st Earl of Essex, Thomas became Staffordshire's Custos Rotulorum, keeper of the rolls, because Robert Devereux, the 2nd Earl of Essex and Elizabeth's distant cousin, was a minor living at Cecil House as Burleigh's ward. In this exchange for merry wives of Windsor, between Shallow, a country justice of the peace, and his cousin Slender, the bard is ribbing his wife's country relatives over their prodigious pride in their gentlemanly heraldic arms and their local legal offices, including Custa Lorem and Ratto Lorem. Several of Elizabeth's relatives played minor roles in the remarkable 1580 to 1604 restructuring of Oxford's real estate portfolio. I am indebted to the de Vere Society's Jeremy Crick for his research and roster on the Trentham family. However, I respectfully disagree that Elizabeth's younger brother Francis had any active role in that restructuring or served as Oxford's new financial advisor and broker. Here is why. In the mid-1570s, while Francis Trentham was still a teenager in Rochester, Oxford began leasing and selling run-down and far-flung properties he had inherited, at first to finance his life at court, and later to purchase income-producing London properties, despite his father-in-law Burleigh's protests. In 1587, while Francis was fighting in the Netherlands with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and inheriting the Trentham sheep farms 150 miles northwest of London, Burleigh grudgingly wrote Walsingham that Oxford, still married to Anne, had devised a way to circumvent the 1570 statute of fraudulent conveyances. 4 years later, in tandem with marrying Elizabeth, Oxford's groundbreaking estate plan was created, circumventing the Court of Wards, an institution about which Oxford knew painfully too much, and Francis little, if anything. Meanwhile, Francis was courting a wife in Beeley, Worcestershire, and serving as Sheriff of Staffordshire. Francis didn't control Elizabeth's betrothal or her dowry. She did. Francis studied law in London in 1584, but there is no evidence that he knew Oxford or anything about London's real estate market. His participation in Oxford's business affairs appears to be limited to being named with others as a title trustee and loaning Elizabeth funds to purchase Hedingham in 1609. In October 1586, a month after Thomas Trentham escorted Mary Queen of Scots to her trial at Fotheringhay Castle, at which Oxford sat as highest-ranking earl, Thomas wrote his last will. Predictably, he left the bulk of his estate to Francis, his eldest son, with bequests to his younger son, Thomas, and 2 married daughters, Dorothy and Catherine, who christened Elizabeth's nieces, Cordelia and Vere. But Elizabeth, already the Queen's Maid of Honor for 5 years, remained unmarried. Knowing that if he died before she wed, by law, her choice of husband and her dowry would be controlled by Francis, Thomas bequeathed her £1,000 dowry directly to his unmarried 23-year-old daughter, to be paid to her or her assigns within 4 years after his decease if she remarried. If she wed within those 4 years, it would be paid to her over 3 years. Giving her control of her dowry, her choice of husband, and her betrothal speaks volumes of a father's absolute trust in his daughter. Even more telling, Thomas instructed that if Francis failed to abide by the will's terms, then the wardships and marriages of Thomas's orphan nephews and the income of a property called Throwley should go to Elizabeth, not Francis. The man who raised both children told posterity that he trusted his daughter's business and financial sense more than his son's. Let's dispel the first myth about Elizabeth, begun, I believe, by Alan Nelson in his character assassination of Oxford, Monstrous Adversary, namely that Elizabeth was an heiress. Not true, not by a long shot. That £1,000 dowry was respectable, equivalent to the Queen's Privy Seal warrant paid annually to Oxford. But Oxford netted many times £1,000 annually selling lands. When compared to other dowries in the Elizabethan courtly marriage market, Elizabeth's pales, and Cecil's was 3 times that much, as was Oxford's daughters Bridget and Mary Sidney Herbert's. Diana Cecil, Burleigh's great-granddaughter, through his eldest son Thomas, brought a £30,000 dowry to Oxford and Elizabeth's son, Henry de Vere, 18th Earl of Oxford. Borrowing from Crocodile Dundee, thou that's an heiress. Elizabeth left country life in her native West Midlands, where she might have married a gentleman landowner and justice of the peace to serve the Queen in a close group of never more than 6 maids of honor. While court offered marriage opportunities at the highest level of Tudor society, serving as a maid of honor required courtly manners and dress, long hours, entertaining the Queen, and the vigilant preservation of one's virtue that she demanded of her maids, with mixed success. Most difficult were earning and keeping the trust of a finicky and hot-tempered monarch. Elizabeth served for 10 years, during which many other maids married, but she did not, nor is there evidence that she took a lover in an environment thick with affairs and bastard children. What was going on? Did she refuse offers and dedicate herself as a Vestal Virgin when she could have married into a comfortable home and motherhood? Was she so clownishly provincial, or so unattractive, or her dowry so inconsequential that she received no offers? Or was it her choice for another reason? We can deduce when Elizabeth arrived at court because Roger Manners, Earl of Rutland, Oxford's friend from their Cecil House days, received interesting epistolary court gossip. You may remember the letter joking that plain and obscure Anne Cecil's catching Oxford, the shiny trophy husband, caused general female wailing at court. Rutland received another letter, dated April 5th, 1582, from J. Farnham, describing 4 marriageable court ladies: Margaret Edgecombe as modest, Mary Radcliffe as comely, Elizabeth Garrett as jolly, and Elizabeth Trentham as fair as ever. While fair can mean beautiful and or alabaster white-skinned, the ever catches my eye. Ever requires that a significant and continuous period of time has passed and still continues. If Elizabeth had arrived in the first quarter of 1582, then in early April, ever would make no sense. Therefore, she must have arrived substantially earlier, likely traveling from Staffordshire to London in January 1581, when her father came to London to represent Staffordshire in the first Parliament held in 9 years. During Elizabeth's decade of service, Oxford's infant son and daughter died. Anne's Roar was published in Pandora. Oxford sailed to the Netherlands as commander of the horse, only to be recalled. Philip Sidney died there instead. Oxford received his first annuity. Mary Queen of Scots lost her head. Thomas Trentham died. The Armada sailed. Anne Cecil and Leicester died within 3 months of each other. And in 1590, Rosalind, or Euphues' Golden Legacy, was published under the name Thomas Lodge. Meanwhile, Elizabeth did her job, delivering messages for and exchanging New Year's gifts with the Queen, living dormitory style with the other maids, and sometimes impersonating the Queen in the presence chamber to relieve her from the tiresome task of hearing petitions. In December 1590, Thomas Churchyard rented rooms for Oxford's men at Julianne Penn's house on St. Peter's Hill in exchange for a bond that Oxford would pay £25 by March or forfeit double. Sometime after March 1591, Mistress Penn wrote Oxford for payment, mentioning she had considered contacting that virtuous gentlewoman, Mistress Trentham, but I thought it not good, because I know not your lordship's pleasure. Whoa! How long has this been going on? If a landlady on St. Peter's Hill knows that Oxford and Elizabeth are an item, then everybody knows. While Oxford certainly spent money on fine horses and armor, troops of players and theater construction, musicians, secretaries, and self-financed diplomatic missions abroad, which also nearly bankrupted Walsingham, Peregrine Bertie, Leicester, and Essex, the main reason for Oxford's near financial collapse in the mid-1580s was begun well before he was born. Nina Green's The Fall of the House of Oxford details the financial disaster Oxford inherited in 1571. It grew to an astonishing £150,000 of debts and fine by 1587. During his 11 years of wardship and suit for his livery, Burleigh controlled his finances and Leicester his lands. The Queen had handed management of Oxford's lands to her lover Leicester, also Oxford's godfather, who pocketed 11 years of profits and made no repairs. According to Green, She delayed returning them because of Oxford's father's debts and her gross mismanagement of Oxford's wardship. On top of his father's debt, the 21-year-old shouldered the Queen's requirement that he pledge her all his lands as security. Green calculated Oxford's May 1572 fine at £2,500 when his yearly revenue was £2,250. From that, annually, the Queen took her thirds, plus principal and interest on the debt. His mother took her maintenance, his uncle's sums owed. From the day he gained access to his lands, Oxford pocketed only about £643 annually for the maintenance of himself, his wife, and his sister, which was less than what was estimated that a gentleman in London needed to be of any account. This explains why, unlike Henry Worsley, Earl of Southampton, Oxford didn't buy his way out of his unwanted betrothal to Anne. He didn't have the money. He had to immediately liquidate his lands, subject to the Queen's lien, and enter into a web of personal guarantees indemnifying purchasers in case the Queen executed her extent and demanded immediate repayment of his father's debt. Shockingly, she appears to have done that in a firestorm of fines and penal bonds in the late 1580s, according to Green. The number of sales and his letters instructing Burleigh to sell my lands have caused many scholars, not just Nelson and Daphne Pearson, to declare Oxford an irresponsible spendthrift and blame him entirely for his debt-ridden state. I hope I have just shown you that is untrue. He had no choice. To make profitable the scattered, neglected portfolio he inherited of farms, forests, towns, manor houses, deteriorating castles, and empty abbeys, Oxford would have had to invest large sums and locate trustworthy managers in Essex, Norfolk, Suffolk, Wiltshire, Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Warwickshire, and Cambridgeshire. Time, travel, and ready funds are finite commodities in real estate. They must be rationed to turn a profit. Selling distant, dilapidated assets and buying a few valuable, centrally located properties which are likely to appreciate is sound real estate practice and exactly what Oxford did. In the 1570s and 80s, he shed useless properties to buy income-producing ones, like the Great Garden at Aldgate, in and near London, a market he understood well and to which he had easy access. With Oxford's creditors closing in, Burleigh wrote Walsingham on May 13, 1587, that Oxford wanted the Queen's proposed gift to him of another noble's attainted lands, deeded to trustees. In exchange, Oxford offered to deed Hedingham to the Queen if she would deed it back to him, remainder to his children by Anne, thereby protecting both properties from creditors and legally avoiding the statute of fraudulent conveyances. The statute required conveyances to the end, purpose, and intent to delay or hinder or defraud creditors. Violation required 6 months imprisonment without bail, fines, and forfeit of the property. But the statute required intent to delay, hinder, or defraud. Oxford's proposal eliminated that intent. The Court of Common Pleas recognized an existing covenant between the Queen and Oxford. She gifted him the attainted lands. She exercised her lien rights on Hedingham. He quit-claimed it to her on the condition of the regrant. Having built my professional legal career over 30 years, designing creative workouts for distressed high-end multi-use commercial real estate projects teetering on disaster, like the current crisis in urban office buildings, I can attest that this was brilliant legal work under the law of the day. Oxford applied the same solution on using the Queen to other properties until May 1591, when he asked Burleigh for joint custody of his children, stating his intention to settle down quietly. Burleigh refused, as did Robert Cecil after Burleigh's death. Concurrently, due to Thomas Skinner's fraud, other bonds became suddenly due. Now, expecting no further help from Burleigh, Oxford responded with an innovative and sophisticated land trust and an estate plan using Elizabeth instead of the Queen. Since maids and married women could not own or manage property, he could not transfer lands only to Elizabeth. So, in the months surrounding their December 1591 wedding, Elizabeth, in control of her own dowry and choice of husband, thanks to her father's foresight, took title to Oxford's lands, with various of her male relatives, like her uncle or her brother, and Oxford's relatives, like Francis Vere or Francis Norris. These transfers date their romantic milestones. For example, Oxford's deed to trustees for Elizabeth's dower of the Great Garden property makes July 4, 1591, their likely betrothal date. The plan was so successful that before he died, his staggering debt to the crown had been reduced to 20 shillings. His heir, Henry, was Elizabeth's ward, not Robert Cecil's, and Headingham, the Great Garden property, Havering at Bower, the forests of Essex and Waltham, and other properties were protected for Henry by Elizabeth. In short, all the wrongs the ward system had wreaked upon Oxford were avoided, but only because of Oxford's extraordinary legal creativity and Elizabeth's unusual business savvy, and her ferocity fending off the vultures who descended once she was widowed. Some modern scholars blame Oxford's impecunious state at death and the absence of a will on his spendthrift ways. They overlook that having no assets in his name was intentionally planned when he married Elizabeth 13 years before, and that it was brilliant, groundbreaking legal work in real property and trust and estates law. It stripped the Oxford earldom of all real property assets and income, thereby effectively making it judgment-proof, passing the ward system, and leaving complete financial control of those assets, that income, and Henry in Elizabeth's very capable hands. We celebrate Oxford's literary talent. We should also celebrate his legal talent. They married in late December 1591. The jealous queen's wedding gift was notably stingier compared to others. In early 1592, they transferred Castle Headingham to Burghley as security for Oxford's girls' dowries, with a proviso that if they had a son, they could exercise a call option and buy it back. In 1609, Elizabeth, as a widow, exercised that call option. A pleasant conceit penned in verse, published in 1593, describes various countesses whose titles match geographical locations. By Thomas Churchard's contemporaneous observations, Elizabeth was calm, serious, and wise. Her skin was alabaster white, and apparently she outshone diamonds when she walked into a room. Her bloodless reputation and Churchard's association of her with Lucina, the goddess of childbirth, confirm her blooming pregnancy and delivery of Oxford's surviving legitimate son and heir, Henry, on February 25, 1593. Henry was conceived in May 1592, within 5 months of their wedding day, while they were living in the manor house in Stoke Newington, with a huge park about 4 miles northeast of London off of Bishopsgate Road. The house's former location is now marked with this plaque, and across the street is St. Mary's Church, the oldest extant Tudor church in England, where Henry was christened. Oxford's last child with Anne was born in May 1587. He went to fight the Spanish Armada, and Anne died from a fever in June 1588. After a sincere mourning period that resulted in some extraordinary plays, and if Twelfth Night is autobiographical, one last attempt to marry the Queen, who was mourning her brother Leicester's death, Oxford abandoned his pursuit of his marble-breasted tyrant and started courting Elizabeth Trentham in 1590. After the shock, scandal, and ridicule that Leicester's rape and impregnating of Anne had cost Oxford, Elizabeth's self-possessed, steady wit was a welcome change. Her very able self-defense of her own virtue, both before and after marriage to Oxford, was worthy of poetic acclaim. In control of her own dowry and choice of husband, she had refused offers of both marriage and illicit liaisons without a misstep for 10 years. It is clear that Elizabeth wanted no one but Oxford, even as she watched him unsuccessfully pursue her mistress, the Queen. But only the unpredictable death of Anne Cecil made their romance and marriage possible, for Elizabeth would have had him no other way. April 1593 marked publication of William Shakespeare's first work, Venus and Adonis, and shortly thereafter, its inseparable companion, The Rape of Lucrece, both dedicated to Southampton. I explain in lectures and other podcasts why these poems are autobiographical of Oxford's life and relate to the betrothal and hoped-for marriage of Southampton and Elizabeth Vere. Here, I only wish to point out that Shakespeare, Oxford's final pen name, produced the English language's most extraordinary works after he married Elizabeth and Henry was born. By all accounts, their marriage gave him great joy, and her capable management of business matters gave him and us the priceless gift of his time. One clue to Oxford's happy state is that he was writing sonnets, urging his eldest son, Southampton, to get married and produce an heir of his own, like this. In September 1597, the Queen licensed the sale of King's Place, empty for years, to Elizabeth, her brother, uncle, and cousin, consistent with Oxford's estate plan of keeping real property out of his name. A substantial country manor enlarged by Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII, it boasted 2 courtyards, a celebrated great hall, classic Tudor long gallery, a chapel, and a proper library to lay books in, set in 450 acres of orchards, gardens, and farmlands. Sadly, heavy Luftwaffe damage necessitated its demolition. Today it looks like this, the site of B6, Sixth Form College, a high school for kids who need a second chance. Evering Road still runs directly to Bishopsgate Road. The month before publication of the sonnets, Elizabeth sold it to Fulk Greville, 5th Baron Willoughby de Brooke, Oxford's cohort in the 1572 Warwick Castle mock battle. The sitter in the Ashburn portrait, now in the Folger Library's vaults, has been identified both as Shakespeare and as a London mayor. Controversy swirls around the overpainting of his hairline, ruff, signet ring, and date. If the Ashburn is of Oxford, originally painted to hang in King's Place Long Gallery, where is Elizabeth's companion portrait? I am no art historian, but among hundreds of portraits, this composed-looking noblewoman with alabaster skin and table-cut diamond buttons caught my eye. Elizabeth's will, dated November 25, 1612, a few weeks before her death from some new disease, required her plate sold for her 400 pounds of debt to Francis and generous gifts to prisoners and the poor. In addition to quarterly payments to my dumb man, which makes us all wonder, she bequeathed to her sister Catherine my black velvet gown laced, my kirtle of white cloth of silver and color cloth of silver, further to my dear and loving son, Henry de Vere, Earl of Oxford, to be kept by him as a remembrance of my motherly love, my rope of great pearl, my 13 diamond buttons. Although all appear in this portrait, these items alone are insufficient to identify the sitter as Elizabeth. An international auction house sold this portrait in 2011, artist unnamed, described as a portrait of a lady, probably Elizabeth Southwell, née Howard, eldest daughter of Charles Howard, 1st Earl, Nottingham. A London gallery bought and sold it the next year as one of 3 Howard lady portraits, identified as Catherine Carey, Countess of Nottingham, and 2 of her daughters. This portrait identified as Elizabeth Howard Southwell. With unmarked portraits this old, provenance greatly influences guesses at the sitter's identity. The provenance, per both galleries, commenced with Elizabeth Southwell's daughter, Catherine's 1618 marriage to Sir Greville Verney, 7th Baron Willoughby de Brooke, then descending through the successive barons Willoughby de Brooke until its 1912 London sale. I have investigated, but found no documentary evidence that this portrait came into the Willoughby de Brooke barons' collection at the 7th Baron in 1618. Therefore, that initial provenance seems to be an assumption without documentation, reasoned backwards from the guess that the sitter was probably Catherine's mother, Elizabeth Southwell. What is documented is that on April 1st, 1609, Elizabeth Trentham received parliamentary permission to sell King's Place, thereafter Brooke House, to the 5th Baron Willoughby de Brook Fulk Greville. Therefore, I think it is possible that this portrait remained in the King's Place Long Gallery when Elizabeth sold the property to Fulk in 1609, then descended through Fulk as the 5th Baron, not through Catherine Southwell's 1618 marriage to the 7th Baron. In that event, her will's bequest of specific clothing and jewels, which also appear in this portrait, make it much more likely that this is Elizabeth Trentham de Vere, Countess of Oxford. When placed side by side, the sitters mirror each other. She holds a jeweled ostrich fan, similar to one owned by the Queen, and he a book. Their fingers seem to want to reach through the frames to caress. The Ashburn's tablecloth is solid bright red on the top horizontal plane, but where the cloth hangs forward off the table's edge, it is patterned in irregular, darker red rectangles, which match the background of the portrait I believe may be of Elizabeth. His right wrist hovers above the skull. Except for the table and the indistinct red shield over his shoulder, the Ashburn's background is completely black. A very odd choice when the sitter is also dressed completely in black. Perhaps the black background, the tablecloth's red top, and that awkward skull were painted later to cover the original background. But lest the sitter be reduced to a disembodied face and hands floating in black space, the cover-up artist left untouched a corner of the original background, repurposed as the forward-hanging tablecloth, its irregular red rectangles only becoming notable when the Ashburn is paired with Elizabeth's portrait. As the Queen's life ebbed, Oxford cut the deal with Cecil and James to support James as king in exchange for Southampton's freedom, restoration of his attainted rights, and James showering Southampton and Oxford's entire family with preferments and honors, which James faithfully did until 1609. As Oxford steered among terrible choices for himself and his family, Elizabeth's capable management of the Oxford earldom's assets was crucial. Eventually, she would do it alone. 10 days after the Queen's funeral, Oxford wrote Cecil about regaining the keepership of Waltham Forest and Haveringham Bower, his by right and custom, for which his family had sued for 60 years. It took another year. Oxford's ground lease of Bretts and Plaistow to Frances to hold for Elizabeth for her life, with reversion to Henry. And 6 days later, on June 24, 1604, the 17th Earl of Oxford passed away. Or what you will. As a widow, Elizabeth could finally legally act on her own behalf. She took it on, like an eagle and a lioness. Within 2 months, she deterred Sir Henry Maynard, whom Cecil had encouraged from buying Hedingham. She stalked Cecil to continue Oxford's annuity and annihilated his claims that she and Henry owed money. She defended Henry's right to choose the schoolmaster of Earl's Con Grammar School. She beat back Sir Edward Coke's aggressive claim to the stewardship at Haveringham Bower and entertained James there. She crisply refuted spurious complaints by fraudulent workmen who misjudged her widowhood for easy prey. When Magdalen College tried to reclaim the Great Garden property it had sold to Oxford 29 years before, she requested and received an Act of Parliament to reaffirm the original sale. She opened negotiations for Hedingham with Cecil, like any seasoned real estate professional, pleading the family's impecunious state and the property's deplorable condition. Note, the price that I tender, from a woman negotiating a business deal with her family's bitterest enemy. Cecil had just enabled 15-year-old Henry's juvenile delinquency by paying a £200 annuity directly to him instead of to her as his guardian. Elizabeth faced challenges, familiar to all parents, in raising her teenage son. One of Henry's second cousins, John Hunt, was a bad influence and siphoning off Henry's ill-gained annuity. When Hunt convinced Henry to borrow and then hock his Aunt Mary's jewels for cash, Elizabeth cornered Henry and Cecil with a single letter to Cecil as Master of the Court of Wards and Henry Howard, Earl of Northampton. She first asked for their help as counselors of state, and he, a young nobleman neither of years nor judgment, to advise himself. choosing words very similar to the Countess of Roussillon's, to a senior counselor about her willful son in All's Well That Ends Well, not published until 1623. "'Tis an unseasoned courtier, my good lord, advise him." Then Elizabeth informed Cecil and Northampton that her letter created evidence that they now had notice detailing Henry's various delinquencies that they needed to fix because she had made it publicly known that they, his great and powerful allies and friends, could easily cause this ivy to be plucked away from this young oak whose growth is so much hindered by it. Choosing words very similar to Prospero's in The Tempest, also not published until 1623. Now he was the ivy which had hid my princely trunk and sucked out my verdure. Did Elizabeth have a stack of Shakespeare's unpublished plays somewhere? The Merchant of Venice Portia is not the only Shakespearean heroine who disguises herself in male attire to face challenges deemed beyond her sphere. Bob Prechter argues persuasively in Oxford's Voices that Oxford wrote under Thomas Lodge's name before he adopted the pseudonym William Shakespeare. Rosalind, or Euphues' Golden Legacy, published as a novella under Lodge's name in 1590, the year Oxford began courting Elizabeth, is, as you like, its acknowledged precursor and a first draft. While brotherly rivalry in the play and the novella comes from the 14th century tale of Gamelin, Rosalind herself is purely the author's creation, and he is obsessed with her. She bravely disguises herself as a youth so that she and her cousin can escape court. They buy a sheep farm and sheep, settling naturally into country life, very like the Trenthams in Roaster. In both works, Rosalind maintains her disguise despite her attraction to Rosander/Orlando, same guy in Bad Poet, different name. Dressed like a man, she pretends to be herself, hilariously tutoring her crush on how best to woo her as a woman. In Golden Legacy, Rosander first sees Rosalind at a joust and wrestling match. She made the cavaliers crack their lances with more courage, and in that place did love and war triumph in a sympathy. He is so smitten with her that he just stares at her and proclaims her excellent. She stares back at him, her eyes sparking favor and disdain, courteous and yet coy. She so fired him with passionate desires that he ran upon the favored challenger and braved him. Before he is declared the tournament's winner, Rosander retires to his tent and writes her a very sweet and sexy sonnet. This reference to unacquainted Phaeton, the son of Helios, the sun god, in Euphues' Golden Legacy, may clue us to the actual time and place of Oxford's and Elizabeth's first encounter. The January 1581 tournament, Oxford won as the Knight of the Tree of the Sun, with his tawny-colored silk tent under his golden tree, when he was gobsmacked by a woman he had never seen before. She wasn't Queen Elizabeth or Anne Vavasor, then 7 months pregnant with his child, because he knew them. Golden Legacy's publication coincides with Oxford's courting Elizabeth, perhaps as its prologue, describing an embarrassing public but very private moment they would both remember 9 years before when she was new to court and he was married with a pregnant mistress. They couldn't take their eyes off each other. She blushed, and he won the tournament to show off to her. Rosalind herself is Euphues' Golden Legacy, golden for that Tree of the Sun joust, and his legacy because legacy is how one's character guides others by example. It is not difficult to find Elizabeth's wit in Rosalind's banter, nor in her character the legacy that led wayward Oxford to mend his faults, to earn her respect. For a glimpse of the blossoming of their love story from her perspective, look no farther than Twelfth Night, where Oxford's personal life twines itself into a Valentine to his second wife. Duke, sometimes called Orsino, is doppelganger for the post-Armado, widowed, musical, and melancholy Oxford, still pining after the unreceptive Queen Elizabeth. The famous opening lines refer to Riviola, the heroine, a small purple flower, and a heart-shaped leaves, and an Italian instrument, La Viola d'Amore, which needs no translation. The plot generally follows its Italian source, Glignati, and Barnaby Riches, another pen name for Oxford per Prechter, 1581, Apollonius and Celia. Resourceful when reduced to nothing by shipwreck, like Portia and Rosalind, Viola devises a solution to her predicament by disguising herself as a male page, one Cesario. On behalf of her master, Orsino, Oxford, whom she secretly loves, she woos Olivia, the queen, who stubbornly mourning her brother's death, Leicester's, rejects Oxford's marriage proposal yet again. Eventually, Orsino abandons his pursuit of Olivia, an uncivil lady to whose ingrate and inauspicious altars my soul the faithfulest offerings hath breathed out, and calls to Viola as Cesario to follow him. Olivia panics. Where goes Cesario? Viola replies, after him I love, more than my life, more by all mores than ever I shall love my wife. Finally, Oxford realizes with whom he is truly in love. Your master quits you, and for your service done him, so much against the mettle of your sex, so far beneath your soft and tender breeding, and since you called me master for so long, here is my hand. You shall from this time be your master's mistress. In this most romantic marriage proposal of all time, Oxford tells the truth. He had purposefully impoverished himself, trusted Elizabeth with all his lands and income, and made her, instead of the queen, his mistress on whom he was completely financially dependent. Their golden time began a decade before at the Tree of the Sun joust, convented when Elizabeth accepted and became Oxford's mistress and his fancy's queen. Thank you for listening. Are we out of time? A minute or two if there are any questions. Or if not?
Leicester was the true father of the daughter?
Excuse me?
Leicester was the true father of the daughter, of Oxford's daughter that he found out about when he was traveling?
He found out it before he left. And yes, I believe that Leicester raped Anne Cecil. Anne came to Oxford confessing and asking for help. There's evidence that Sir Thomas Smith got an abortifacient and gave it to Oxford for Anne. So he knew, yeah. Nope, that's it. Okay. Thank you.